Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our next lesson. This is the basic logic and critical thinking section of the course. As I mentioned before, logic kind of is central to doing philosophy in every area of philosophy. For the most part anyway, the emphasis is on the production of, or the creation and the analysis of arguments for different positions or different philosophical views. And so it's just something that's very fundamental to the discipline as a whole. And it's also a useful practical skill to have. So in this section, we're going to cover some very basic principles of reasoning. If you were taking a more advanced logic class, some of the stuff you would be going into it in much more detail than we're going to go into. In this lesson, I'm mainly concerned to teach you some of the basic vocabulary and different types of reasoning, some of the basic types of arguments, the vocabulary that goes along with evaluating those arguments and talking about arguments, at least in philosophy, and then to learn some basic errors of reasoning to avoid, and that are central to evaluating the difference between good and bad arguments. So picking up on that idea, let's get started here. So as we mentioned last time, we've got this technical or textbook definition of philosophy that's our working definition for the course. There's probably no completely satisfactory way of defining philosophy, but here's a pretty good attempt at doing so that moves us beyond just kind of the love of wisdom or big question type of definition. So again, we've got this definition, this working definition of attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical reasoned beliefs that have universal importance with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. That's from a textbook called Classic Questions in Contemporary Film, which is an introduction to philosophy that I often use for this course, but that we're not using this semester. And so, again, we've talked about in the previous lecture and what is philosophy lecture, we talked about this idea of a contradiction. And how are we going to attempt to remove contradictions? That involves constructing and analyzing arguments. And so that's where logic comes in. So logic is just one of the basic subfields of academic philosophy that's concerned with correct reasoning or the study of good and bad forms of reasoning. And the kind of key thing to pick up on there is that by good and bad, I don't simply mean effective for producing belief in people or in oneself. So there might be lots of different ways that are non-rational or even irrational that are effective for producing belief in people or in oneself. What we're concerned with is good and bad forms of reasoning in terms of tracking truth, not just simply getting people to believe something. So for example, we might use all sorts of emotionally manipulative tactics to produce belief in people, but they might not be logical ways of producing beliefs. And so what we're worried about in philosophy is the logical production of beliefs or justification of beliefs rather than just emotionally persuading people. And we'll come back to that idea with the informal fallacies, the errors in reasoning that we look at the end of this section and that you read about in the ARP article or in the Classic Questions if you had a reading assignment that came from that textbook. So remember this idea of a contradiction. Sometimes in logic we use variables like P, Q, R, and S, lowercase letters, to stand in for parts of propositions or statements. And so we could represent a contradiction as a P, so an affirmative statement, and then the negation, not P, of that same statement. So I have that illustrated here with two different theses. The first thesis is the relativist thesis, the idea that there are, or excuse me, it's the non-relativist thesis, or the view that says that there are at least some universal truths. And there are many different arguments that might be given for any particular philosophical position or any position, philosophical or scientific. There might be many lines of evidence or reasoning that support the same conclusion. And so I have listed two different arguments for the idea that there are some objective truths. I need to correct one of those there. these are actually set up incorrectly. So let me pause here and actually fix that, and then I'll come back here and we'll have a little editing jump because I've reversed some stuff here. So I'm going to take that out and put it over here and put this one over here. I remember what I did when I was setting this up here. All right, so let me share this again. After it's fixed. That back up there. So here we have it corrected here. So on the left side of the screen, we have the view that there are some universal truths, right? And in logic, some means at least one, right? So that's all that sum is really referring to there. It doesn't have to be more than one. It just has to be at least one. And on the other side, the not P, we have the relativist thesis, the view that there are no universal truths. In other words, that there are just particular truths that are dependent upon or relative to individuals. And there are many different arguments that we might give for those positions. And so resolving a contradiction would mean evaluating each of those arguments and seeing which side had more or the better argument on its side, logically speaking. And again, what we mean by the better argument, logically speaking, we'll flesh that idea out here in this lecture. So the first thing is this idea of an argument. I have a more technical definition of an argument in mind here, and that we'll be using in this class as well. I don't simply mean a debate between two people or a disagreement between two people or two or more parties. What I have in mind is this idea of a group of statements or propositions such that the truth of at least one of them, called the premise, and if there's more than one premise, and there usually are, the premises, is said or alleged to support the truth of the other proposition, the point that we're trying to prove, the conclusion, right? And so often arguments will contain a factual claim and then an inferential claim. Logic can be thought of as the study of good and bad inferences, right? Because facts are relevant in any discipline or almost any discipline. Much of the natural sciences, what they do is go about trying to figure out facts about the empirical world. And so we might think of having two different kinds of truths here, factual truths and then logical truths. Again, a point that we'll come back to later. And so an argument is a group of propositions that try to prove something, right? And there are many other types of expressions that are non-arguments. So a mere statement of belief, reports, warnings, single conditional statements or propositions. Those are not necessarily arguments, and many times they are not arguments. And then sometimes you might have expository passages, explanations, or illustrations that involve arguments. It just depends on the context there. But the key idea then is that an argument has to have at least, might have more, but it has to have at least two statements, at least one premise, and then a conclusion, and then an alleged connection between the truth of the premise and the conclusion. And I say alleged because arguments can fail. Right? Doesn't mean it's not an argument, just would mean it's not a good argument. So here's that technical definition of an argument then. A group of propositions, at least one of which the premise is said to support the truth of the other, the conclusion. And so an argument has three basic parts to it. At least one premise, that's the statement or statements that express the reasons or the evidence that's being offered up in support of the conclusion, that's the other premise. And then the alleged connection between the truth of the premise or premises and the truth of the conclusion, that's the inference. That's the logical part of the argument. So here we have a classic example of an argument put in proper or standard form. And what I mean by that is that the argument is just set up so we have the premises in the order that they are said to lead to the conclusion. And so they're numbered off to the side here. The first two are premise lines, and then the last line is the conclusion, line 3. And so we have all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? So in this case, we have a syllogistic argument with a universal premise up top, a particular one, and then a particular conclusion at the bottom. There are two different main types then of reasoning or argumentation. we've got deductive reasoning and then non-deductive or inductive reasoning. And the difference is that in deductive reasoning, the truth of the conclusion is said to follow necessarily, right? Strong language there, necessarily from the truth of the premises, such that if the argument is the correct form, it's not an invalid argument, has a correct form, and the premises are actually true, then the conclusion would necessarily be true. Couldn't be otherwise. In non-deductive or inductive reasoning, it's a matter of probability, right? So higher or lower probabilities, more or less likely. So we use that language in everyday life, but we also have that in mathematics as well. If you go over to the casino, you're worried about the probability of the dice rolling a particular combination, or a particular probability of getting a particular card if you're playing poker, right? In many areas of inquiry or many areas of study, the best we can do is inductive reasoning. Trying to predict the weather is an inductive matter, right? Lots of variables that can change frequently. It's an inductive matter. And then sometimes we have deductive reasoning, right? So let's look at deductive reasoning first. And what we're going to do here is I'm just going to kind of quickly here rehearse or go over some of the basic valid deductive forms of reasoning, mainly so that you'll see, so that you won't be surprised and will have an idea of what we do later on in the semester. I'm kind of giving an abbreviated version of the lecture here today. So I'm just going to use some of the basic forms. I'm not even going to go over all the forms that I've included here in the presentation because I'm not going to use all of them this semester. We're going to keep it pretty simple because we're in the intersession and it's an accelerated course. And so I'll just go over a couple of basic forms here. This is the deductive reasoning is, well, in probabilistic reasoning as well. This is the more mathematical aspect of doing philosophy. So if you're really going to get serious about working out arguments for the existence of God or the probability of God, you have to deal with the mathematics of probability. We're going to do it in a much more fuzzy and a less rigorous way, in a more introductory way. And so here's some basic forms of valid deductive argument reasons. I'll come back to this notion of validity in a minute, but these are correct forms, meaning that if the premises in them are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. And we've got 5 basic forms. If you were in a logic class, they would call these some of the basic rules of inference. Again, inference, the logical relationship between propositions, or the alleged relationship between the truth of propositions. So first we have mode of affirmation, or modus ponens. We got modus tollens, mode of negation, disjunctive syllogism, big constructive dilemma, and hypothetical syllogism. I'm not going to go over each one of these. I'll try to keep it a little bit more simple here for us. So the first one, let's just look at modus ponens, very common argument form. And it has this structure. If P, then Q, that's the first premise, the conditional premise, in which there's the antecedent, the first part of the if part of that proposition or statement, and then the consequent, the then, right, which is Q in this case. Again, I'm just using P, Q, R, and S for placeholders for propositions. So here's the argument in full sentence, right, with some content. If Martin Luther King was assassinated, then he is dead. Martin Luther King was assassinated, therefore Martin Luther King is dead. That argument has this if P, then Q is the first premise. P, the affirmation of the antecedent. That's why it's called mode of affirmation, modus ponens. Thus Q is the conclusion then. So in this argument form, it's pretty simple. You have one premise that lays out a conditional statement, the affirmation of whatever's in that antecedent spot, and then whatever is the consequent, in this case it happens to be Q, is derived as the conclusion. I say whatever is in the antecedent or consequent spot because you might have an argument that has a negation as one of the antecedents or the consequence. Here's modus tollens, or an example of modus tollens. If Great Britain won the Revolutionary War, then the United States is still subject to British rule, but the US is not still subject to British rule, thus Great Britain must not have won the Revolutionary War. Mode of negation. In this example, we have a premise that's a conditional statement again, if P then Q, but in the simple premise that just has one variable in it, we have the negation of the consequent, and that allows us to derive the negation of whatever's in the antecedent spot. In this case, it's P as the conclusion. So the opposite of P is not P. So that's the negation of P, derived as the conclusion there. Here's a disjunctive syllogism. Disjuncts are either ors, right? In this case, there's just two options that are presented. So either George Washington was the first US president or Abraham Lincoln was. Doesn't have to have either there, just has to have an either or, an or, right, in the language. Even if someone were to say either or just use a sentence with or, you would know that they're splitting things up most of the time. There's an ambiguity in English there to worry about, with where or sometimes means but or and. Then we have the negation in the simple premise of one of those options, and that allows us to derive the disjunct that was not negated as the conclusion. So it has an either P or Q is the first premise. We have the negation, not P, of one of those two disjuncts. In this case, we have disjuncts, not consequent and antecedents, because it's not a conditional statement, but a disjunctive statement. And again, that allows us to derive the consequent, or excuse me, the disjunct that was not negated as the conclusion. Now it could have P, Q, R, or S, and then not P, not R, and the conclusion be S. The thing to pick up on here is that the disjuncts, the either or part, or if there's a trilemma, if it was more than one disjunct, that some of them are negated, and what isn't negated is derived as the conclusion. So those are some basic argument forms. I'll maybe introduce some more to you as we go through the material. Let's talk a minute then about evaluating these deductive forms of reasoning. Deductive arguments are either valid or invalid, and sound or unsound. If an argument is valid, that means, as I say here, it means that it's impossible to have the structure or argument form. I'm talking about formal logic, the structure of the argument. It's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. That means out of all the logically possible combination of true and false premises, all the different combinations that you might have, it's impossible to have a combination in which all of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. In other words, if the premises are true, the conclusion is going to be guaranteed to be true. So that's just about the structure of the argument. When we talk about soundness, we're worried about whether or not the premises are actually true or if they're false. So you could have a valid argument that is unsound, meaning that the structure is correct, but it's just that it has a false premise in there, so a false premise can't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. An invalid argument means that even if the premises are true, it doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, right? So what we're looking for are arguments that are both valid and sound. Soundness always presupposes validity, right? And then there's this thing called the counterexample method of proving validity. Again, that's a thing that we can get into later in the semester that I'll introduce if we need to. But it's a way of proving an argument form is invalid. For the most part, we're not going to worry so much about that in the arguments that I set up in my other lectures. We'll be worried about what we'll set up them as valid arguments, then worry about whether or not they're sound or unsound. So here's an example of this counterexample method, just real quickly. Let's call this the Jimmy Buffett argument. If Jimmy Buffett has been killed in a plane crash, then he is dead. That's a true statement, because no matter who, if you get killed in a plane crash, that entails necessarily that you are dead, right? Jimmy Buffett was not killed in a plane crash. That's true. I looked it up again this morning to make sure he was still with us, or at least that if he was with us. If he was not with us, that he wasn't killed in a plane crash. So we have two true statements, and then the conclusion, thus Jimmy Buffett is not dead. That's still a true statement as well, as of this morning. So some people might look at that and say, it's got all true, it's got true premises and a true conclusion. That means the argument is valid. But this argument form is actually invalid. It might look close to modus ponens or modus tollens, which are valid forms, but it's deceptively similar to those. It's not actually either of those argument forms. So the counterexample method involves identifying the underlying structure of the argument, coming up with a substitution example or instance in which it is possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. And if you can do that, then you show the original argument is invalid and you can reject the argument. Again, what we're looking for are arguments that are both valid and sound. not just valid. So let's call that the Jimmy Buffett argument, the parrot head argument. Here's my substitution instance, but first note that here's the underlying structure of that argument. If P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. You might think, oh, that looks like modus tollens, but in fact, it's not a modus tollens. In modus tollens, the consequent is negated, not the antecedent. And in here, we have the denial of the antecedent. And so here's my substitution instance. So coming up with a substitution instance might involve a lot of mental work because you're having to think through all the logical possibilities of trying to come up with a instance that has the same form as the original argument, same structure as the original argument, but that does have true premises and a false conclusion. So if George Washington was assassinated, then he's dead, true statement. George Washington was not assassinated, true statement, according to our history. And then George Washington is not dead. That's a false statement. So notice that those two arguments have the same exact structure, but I was able to come up with an instance of that structure that had true premises and a false conclusion. That means the original argument is invalid. That's actually, so in other words, what's that showing is that even if the premises are true in that original structure, they don't guarantee necessarily the truth of the conclusion. That argument form is actually an invalid form called denying the antecedent. It's one of our formal fallacies. And so I'll come back to fallacies here in a minute. What you need to know are fallacies are bad arguments. So here are actually two of our formal fallacies, two of the most basic formal fallacies, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Notice they are deceptively similar to modus ponens, but they are not, in fact, those forms. They're slightly different. So when we're looking at evaluating deductive arguments, again, first you got to make sure it's a deductive argument. Then you're worried about valid or invalid. If you can show that it's invalid, then you can reject the argument on structure alone. If it's a valid argument, you got another question to ask. Are the premises all true? That's a sound argument. That's what we're looking to produce. That counts as a good argument, right? Logically speaking. If the argument is valid but unsound, again, that means there's at least one false premise, and an argument, even if it's a valid argument, in order to prove the truth of the conclusion, all the premises have to be true as well. That probably makes pretty much common sense, right? A false claim can't support a true conclusion. Some other claim that's true might support that conclusion, but a false claim can't support a true conclusion. All right, so that's some basic, very basic deductive reasoning, deductive logic. Now let's look at some inductive reasoning. And again, you might pause here in the lecture to go back and review what we just covered, right? Before moving on here to the inductive section. In this section, we're going to be worried about arguments that just try to establish their conclusion with some degree, a higher degree of probability. And so an inductive argument here is one in which the truth of the conclusion allegedly follows with a high degree of probability or likeliness from the truth of the premises. So keep that distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning or arguments in mind here. One of them is about necessity and the other one is about probability. So here we're not worried about, with inductive arguments, we're not worried about strong arguments or valid arguments or invalid arguments. We're worried about strength and weak arguments. Strong meaning that if the premises are true, it's highly likely that the conclusion is true. Weak meaning that even if the premises are true, it's unlikely that the conclusion is going to be true. So again, the idea of a fallacy is going to come in there here. And again, I'll come back to that idea of a fallacy more thoroughly here towards the next section. So a cogent argument, what we're looking for with regard to inductive reasoning is a cogent argument. That means an argument that is both strong in terms of how it's formulated and has true premises. Cogent means all true premises in an inductive argument. So cogency is kind of like soundness, but strength and weakness are not like validity and invalidity, because validity is an all or nothing matter and strength is a matter of probability or degree. So we got some basic types of inductive arguments or inductive reasoning. We're just going to look at the first two here for our purposes. An inductive generalization and an argument by analogy. We'll look at argument by analogy is very common in legal reasoning, in moral reasoning, political reasoning. And we'll look at an argument for theism later in the semester in the philosophy of religion section that is an analogical version of the design argument or teleological argument for God's existence. So here's an inductive generalization. It's an argument that proceeds by laying out something that's the case about a sample of a group and then tries to generalize that all or most of the members of that group have that same characteristic or property. So here's the basic format. Premise one, again, laying out the evidence that's a sample of a group or a category. Members of a category or members of a group have some property, P, whatever P happens to be. Thus, and then here's the conclusion, line 2 in this case. Thus, it's likely that all or most of the group has property P, right? So let's look at an example of this. Inductive generalization here. Crate X contains 5 pineapples. 3 randomly selected pineapples from crate X are ripe. Thus, probably all the pineapples in the crate are ripe. Well, here we have we have more than 50%. We have, what is it, 3/5, right? Have been sampled, and so there's a small margin of error, so it's likely that maybe they're again just probable that the rest of them are ripe as well. But here's another version. Crate Y contains 100 pineapples. We select 3 of those, and they're ripe. But the conclusion is thus all or most of the pineapples in that crate are ripe, but that's a very small sample. So here we would worry about a weak argument or a hasty generalization fallacy even. So in the first example, where we selected 3 out of 5, we have a strong cogent argument. In the second example, where we only have 3 of 100, we have a weak inductive generalization. We have argument by analogy. So analogies are where comparisons are made between 2 events or 2 things. And an argument by analogy is where we try to prove some other statement's true on the basis of a comparison or an analogy, right? So here's the basic format of an argument by analogy. We have event or object A, and it has properties P, Q, R, and S. 2, event or object B has properties P, Q, and R, thus it's likely that B also has property S. So we're reasoning on the basis of the fact that it shares 3 characteristics in common, that it's likely to have this other characteristic that the first object had as well. Don't get caught up on the number of the analogs, the points of comparison. In my example of the format here, I have 3, P, Q, and R. But it only has to have 1 point of comparison. Obviously, if there are more points of comparison and they're relevant to the truth of the conclusion, then the stronger the argument would be here. So Jane and Nancy were both awarded National Merit Scholarships, and both are math majors who love mathematics. Both also appreciate Professor Smith's approach to teaching. Jane did extremely well in Smith's calculus class, received an A. Therefore, it's likely that Nancy will earn an A as well. Argument by analogy. Here's another one. Hamlet, Macbeth are both plays written by William Shakespeare. They're 2 plays written in Elizabethan English. They're about the same length. Mary was able to read Hamlet in 1 evening. Therefore, it's likely she'll be able to read Macbeth in 1 evening as well. So when we're looking at arguments by analogy, just like in inductive generalizations, we need to worry about the sample size, right? In arguments by analogy, we need to worry about whether the comparison that's made, the characteristics that are being compared, are really relevant to the truth of the conclusion, and if there are any dissimilarities that are left out. So you need to make sure that the similarity between A and B is definitely relevant to establishing the truth of the conclusion. If we were comparing the 2 students in the last one, their hair color or something like that, that wouldn't be relevant to establishing their grade, right? What they're likely to get about the grade. And then secondly, the 2 things that are being compared can't be dissimilar in any relevant way to the conclusion. Otherwise, you got to watch out for what's called a weak analogy fallacy there. So when we're looking at inductive reasoning or non-deductive reasoning, again, what we're worried about are figuring out the difference between strong and weak arguments. Weak arguments are fallacious. Again, I'll come back to that, just as invalid arguments are fallacious. And then what we're looking for are strong arguments that have true premises. In other words, cogent arguments. So cogent means both that the argument is strongly formulated and that the premises are actually true. If it's a strong argument that has one false premise, again, we can reject the argument. If the argument's weak, we can reject the argument on logical grounds. So you might be wondering, well, what would a strong argument look like that is uncogent? Well, if I have this, suppose I'm reasoning that so here's my argument. All of the meteorites found so far contain magnesium. Thus, the next meteorite we find will likely contain magnesium. So far as I know, it's not the case that all the meteorites that we found on Earth so far contain magnesium. So that if it were the case, then we would have good reason to think that the next one would probably contain magnesium as well. But but that's actually false so far as I know. So if I use something more obvious, like all the meteorites found so far on Earth contain cotton candy, it would be more obvious that it's a false claim, right? But if they did contain cotton candy, or if they did contain magnesium, we would have good reason to think that the conclusion probably follows from that. So that's evaluating non-deductive arguments then, or inductive arguments. So again, just some basic language, basic vocabulary, and some basic types of arguments that you'll see. Sometimes the authors of your articles that you've been assigned being used, or if you're using classic questions as the textbook for the class, you'll see the author using these basic argument forms in the commentary or the discussion of various philosophical positions. Arguments fail, as we've already kind of indicated, if they're either weak or invalid, or if they have a false premise. So we already know some errors of reasoning to avoid. Another type of error in reasoning to avoid is a fallacy. In fact, we've already looked at two formal fallacies very briefly. Now we'll look at informal fallacies. So a formal fallacy, that only occurs in deductive reasoning, where we're worried about the structure, the form of the argument. So they got to have correct form, a valid form. Informal fallacies have to do with the content of the language, what philosophers call the propositional content of the statements, not just the underlying structure of them. And so these are errors in reasoning based on ambiguity in language, or the meaning of terms, or maybe types of weak induction is another type of informal fallacy. There's these things called fallacies of relevance, where the language that's used or the reasons that are given are not, the content of them is not relevant to the conclusion, right, or the truth of the conclusion. And so here we got to worry about looking at the language, the actual content of the arguments, rather than just the structure of them, like we were doing with the two formal fallacies that we briefly mentioned in the deductive reasoning section. So again, we have this definition of an argument, group of propositions, at least one of which is said to support the truth of the conclusion. A fallacy then is an error in reasoning, but since there are different types of error in reasoning, we need to specify what a fallacy is. It's an error in reasoning such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. That's really what a fallacy is. So it doesn't really mean just a false statement. It means an argument such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. So I say here that our arguments can fail in three basic ways, right? There are more ways, but these are the three basic ways. One, they might have a factual error, an argument that contains a premise that is disproven by science or empirical verification. So if I have the argument, if the moon is made of blue cheese, then I can consume the moon, I can eat the moon. The moon is made of blue cheese, therefore I can eat the moon. Very simple modus ponens argument, in fact, so it has a valid form. But that's an argument in which the second premise, the moon is made of blue cheese, is false. And we know that because we've sent people to the moon. It's made of rock, not blue cheese. Factual error is something that we know on the basis of observation of the world or the use of this, a result of the scientific method that's been confirmed. Another way in which arguments can fail is they might contain a logical contradiction, which is called a self-defeating or self-refuting or self-contradictory argument. We'll talk about that idea, which is going to be very important for us in this class in the second lecture on critical thinking that's on the article from Johnson, and covers that material. So that we'll look at that a little bit later. What we're going to look at in the last part of this presentation or lecture is the notion of a fallacy. So this is another kind of logical error. A logical contradiction is obviously a logical error as well, but a fallacy is a logical error, and you need to match that idea of a fallacy up with both the idea of deductive invalidity and an inductively weak argument. Right? So an invalid argument is formally fallacious. An inductively weak argument is also inductively weak. It means even if the premises are true, it's likely that the conclusion could still be false. Right? And deductive, even if the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. That's our notion of invalid argument. So these are logical errors, again, such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion, either because of invalidity or because of weakness. Right? And again, what we're worried about here are errors in reasoning based on the content, not just the underlying structure of the argument. So one of the best ways to get our heads around this idea of rational persuasion or logical persuasion versus emotional or merely rhetorical persuasion is by thinking about an appeal to emotion. This is a fallacy that's not covered in the ARP article. It is a very common fallacy, so I've included it here. And I've got a pop culture example of it. So let's watch this first. I'm going to play it here off the internet, and hopefully this will work as a way of showing it to you. The example here comes from a clip of the Daily Show back when Jon Stewart was the host of it, so many years ago for most of y'all.
Many people don't know that prior to joining our staff, Steve Carell was one of Madison Avenue's top advertising executives. He uses this experience as well as his experience as a pioneering, let's say, astronaut in a segment we call Ad Nauseam. When it comes to advertising, an emotional appeal will always be more successful than an appeal to the intellect. Emotions are powerful, and even better, they're easy to manipulate. Nowhere is this more evident than in ads dealing with health and well-being.
We're Pfizer. We're working to create a world where there will be a cure for your father's Alzheimer's.
My father?
Your sister's heart condition.
My sister has a heart condition?
Your best friend's diabetes.
Jesus Christ, Freddie!
The new Pfizer is poised to do more for human health than any other pharmaceutical company in history.
Okay, I say. For a minute there, I thought everyone I love was dying. But it turns out Pfizer was just trying to scare me into thinking everyone I love was dying. Got me. You see, advertisers know that the threat of a horrifically painful disease that ravages both body and mind and leaves you helpless and forsaken, wallowing in your own bodily excretions and begging for the sweet relief of merciful death can be quite an attention getter.
Sister's heart condition, diabetes, cancer, AIDS, Pfizer.
I'm sold. But instilling fear in the consumer isn't only useful in selling drugs that save lives. It also works for more important things.
Will she feel the same way if you lose your hair?
Sure. She'll just feel it about somebody else.
Don't worry, I love you.
Well, we'll see how long that lasts. After all, science has shown that bald guys are pathetic losers who can't hold on to their women. Just look at this guy with the imperceptibly receding hairline and unnoticeable thinning. It's a miracle she's still in the same room with him.
Anyway, you don't have to lose it.
Are you talking about Rogaine?
Rogaine. Maybe. Why not?
Yeah, why not? You'll save your shallow relationship and a lot of embarrassment. Take it from me. John.
Thank you, Steve. We'll be right back.
All right, let's get back to the definition of appeal to emotion here. Make that bigger. I did that the wrong way there. There we go. So appeal to emotion. This is one of our informal fallacies. And again, this one in particular helps us get across this idea or this distinction between rhetorical or merely rhetorical persuasion, persuasion through non-rational means, versus rational persuasion or logical persuasion. So the appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by appealing to or manipulating the audience's emotions rather than by presenting impartial reasons and evidence to support a conclusion. Common versions of this include the appeal to pity, appeal to fear, and there are a couple other versions as well. We saw the fear version in the example from the Daily Show there, appeal to maybe personal vanity there as well. Fear of losing your relationship, your romantic relationship or significant other, right? And so in logic and in philosophy, what we're worried about is we're worried about reasons that are impartial, right? Or logical, person neutral, impartial or objective reasons, even if they're not empirical reasons. That are publicly accessible, right, and can be publicly evaluated, right? In other words, they don't just depend on what's on the inside of my head or how I feel about something. That would be stuff that's subjective, person-specific, or people-specific, right? Even if it was a collection of people that had a particular feeling, that wouldn't make their conclusion true, right? So the appeal to emotion can occur in different ways. Here's one of the main ways that it occurs is this appeal to pity, right? There's a Latin name for it, but we're not going to worry about the Latin name. It's our argument ad miscordium. Many of these have Latin names because they were codified way back when, or identified and cataloged by scholars that used Latin. So appeal to, here's an example then of a fallacious appeal to pity argument. Professor, I know that I have not had the best attendance in class and I've done horrible on almost all the assignments, but if I get another D, then I will lose my scholarship and have to move back home with my parents. Surely you don't want me to suffer that and move back home. It would be humiliating for me. So you can see your way fit to get me a C. So the conclusion that they're offering is that you ought to give me a C. And the reason for that, that they're giving as the reason, right, is the justification there is because it would be horrible for the student, right? You don't want the student to feel horrible, so you should give them a better grade. So appeal to emotion, the name of these fallacies indicates what's fallacious about the inference, right? So again, fallacy, even if those are true, that you'd have to move back home, you would feel horrible, and you'd lose your scholarship, those are all emotional ploys, right? They might all be true in the sense that it might be a matter of fact that you will lose your scholarship and have to move back home, but the mere feeling, you don't want to feel bad, I mean, you don't want me to feel bad isn't a good reason for, or a relevant reason for assigning grades. After all, grades are supposed to be assigned on the basis of what you accomplished, not that something unfortunate is going to happen to you because you got a bad one. So appeal to emotion. Next fallacy up, argument ad hominem. So this one is discussed in the Chewbacca defense and in most readings that I assign on fallacies. If you were assigned classic questions in contemporary film, the appeal to emotion or appeal to pity is in there. It's just not in the ARP article that I've assigned in other classes, or maybe only assigned that article. But I am including it here. Right, so argument against the person or ad hominem attack. There are many versions of this as well. One of the main ones is ad hominem abusive. And this fallacy occurs when involves two arguers, and it occurs when one of them advances directly or indirectly an argument and the other arguer responds by attacking some aspect of the arguer's person or character rather than the argument they advanced against the person, right? It tells you what's going on in the argument. So instead of attacking the evidence and the reasons that are a part of the argument, I am attacking the person that gave the argument and then saying that that's a reason for us to reject the conclusion as true, right? As objectively true. Likewise, if I were saying really good things about the person that was giving the argument, that wouldn't make the conclusion true, right? So you need to think about these things in that way, and start thinking about, well, just because something is that I don't like about that arguer doesn't mean that their argument is bad or their conclusion is false. And just because something about the arguer that I like, maybe it's my dad or my wife, that doesn't make their conclusion true either, right? Fallacies of relevance there. Even if the premises are true, they don't necessarily or even probably imply that they're not connected in any logical way to the truth of the conclusion. So here's an example of an ad hominem abusive. And I'll usually just in class talk about this as just ad hominem. It's one of the most basic versions of it, usually the first version that people learn. So we have here, here's the argument. Mr. Smith argues that we should legalize marijuana for both personal liberty and economic reasons, but Smith is just a dope smoking hippie that wants to spend his time getting high rather than being a productive member of society. So obviously the notion we should legalize marijuana is ridiculous. So the reason given for rejecting the truth of the conclusion is not a problem with either the personal liberty argument or a problem with the economic reasons argument, get more tax money out of it or something. It's something about the arguer themselves, right? So it's attacking the person rather than the argument. That's ad hominem. And this one, my example is the ad hominem abusive. As I list here, there are different versions of this as well. Guilty by association, ad hominem circumstantial, poisoning the well. So in many cases, we have a basic idea and then a couple of varieties of this. And we'll see this is true later on with false cause fallacy later in the semester as well. Next up, then we have straw man fallacy. This fallacy occurs when I take a position, I distort it, make it look weak and ridiculous, beat up on the weak or distorted version. Usually it's so distorted that people that actually advocate for that conclusion wouldn't accept that argument as a characterization of their position or their argument. Then I beat up on that distorted straw man, right? And then act like I've defeated the position. So here's an example of this. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg is advocating atheism. So something that's unpopular, right? But atheism is what they have in Russia. It leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for this country? I hardly think so. So therefore, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense, right? So making the argument look weak or ridiculous, easier to attack, beating up on that version of the argument, and then pretending like I've defeated the reason for accepting or rejecting the position that was offered. Here's a red herring. So you look, just going back to straw man fallacy, you see that in political debates on cable news all the time, where they're distorting the position, making it look ridiculous. Therefore, we should reject that view. Red herring is another fallacy, and it occurs when an arguer distracts the audience's attention by changing or shifting subjects, then draws a conclusion about the second subject, or merely implies or presents an innuendo that a conclusion about it has been established. So it's a diversionary tactic. Red herring is throwing us off the trail. So it may be subtly related, but it is a shift in subject or topic. So I know I earned a B+. Here's my example. I know I earned a B+ average based on how I did on all the graded work, but I put a lot of effort into studying for this class. I'm not saying the B+ is a bad grade, but it doesn't reflect just how much work and effort I put into the class over the semester, so I deserve an A. So you ought to give me an A. But of course, here's the shift in subject, right? Grades are supposed to be based on your actual achievement, right? It's not a measure, it's a measure of what you actually did in terms of achievement, not the effort that you went into trying to make that achievement, right? So a shift in topic there. In South Park, we see a blatant example of this. In fact, it's the fact that it's such a radical shift in topic, in subject matter that drives the humor of the situation, the Chewbacca defense itself, right? So where Chewbacca lives is irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion at hand, the topic at hand, namely whether Chef wrote the song or not. So you can look that clip up if you want to watch it, or I posted the link to it on Moodle as well. Next, we have appeal to false or inappropriate or unqualified authority, irrelevant authority, right, for the subject matter of the argument. So Arguments from expertise are important. We claim to know a lot of what we know on the basis of the testimony or the consensus, some kind of expert consensus. But they need to be an expert in the relevant area for the argument. So an appeal to false or unqualified authority occurs when or a fallacious appeal to authority occurs when the arguer appeals to or cites an authority figure's claims as justification for the truth of some conclusion, but they're an authority figure. They may be an authority figure, but not in the relevant or right way. So here's my example, and this will drive home the point of what I mean by the right kind of expert for the subject matter. So the preacher at my church says evolution is junk science. He's a very smart man with a PhD in theology, so evolution must really be pseudoscience. Well, his expertise is in theology, not in biology, right? So just on the basis of his authority in an irrelevant area of expertise, we can't conclude that what he's claiming is true about this other area. So it's like this is like the philosophical or logical version of the "my daddy says" argument. Well, if daddy's not an expert in the subject matter of the content of that argument, then it doesn't matter that he's an authority figure to you, your daddy, right? In other words, that he's an authority to you in a particular way, the father, right, doesn't mean that what he's saying is true about this other topic. So, well, you get the idea, right? If we're worried about, to use a contemporary example, if we're worried about whether or not coronavirus is transmittable in certain ways, we need to appeal to the authority of epidemiologists and doctors, right? Medical scientists that study that sort of thing. I wouldn't say, well, my niece, who is a nurse, says X about coronavirus's transmittability or communicability. Just because she's a nurse doesn't mean might mean she knows something, but not as much as the epidemiologist, right? So hasty generalization. We looked at an inductive generalization earlier. That's just a type of inductive argument. When inductive generalizations are weak, it's the same thing as a hasty generalization fallacy. Okay? Meaning that, again, even if the premises are true, they're insufficient for proving the truth of the conclusion, even with a high degree of probability. So a hasty generalization occurs when we draw a general conclusion about an entire group based on an unrepresentative sample, right? Another way in which hasty generalizations work is like stereotyping on the basis of an irrepresentative sample. So recall that in inductive generalization arguments, it requires a representative sample of the group. So that's where you get into the statistics of sampling and all that sort of thing. So here's my example of a hasty generalization argument. Or a weak inductive generalization. I've met 5 New Yorkers and they were all rude. Therefore, it's probably true that all New Yorkers are rude. Well, all New Yorkers, there's millions of people in New York City, and the 5 that I happen to come across isn't a representative sample of all of those. So here in this version, we also have an anecdotal problem because it's just the ones that I know. So it's not a representative sample of, statistically speaking, of all of the numbers of people. It's an insufficient sample. Next, we have slippery slope. So this fallacy occurs when an arguer claims that X will cause Y, where there's a long causal chain of intermediary events that's said to lead down the hill, down the slope, to some bad outcome, right? But where there's not enough evidence to suggest, even with a matter of probability or a matter of necessity, that X will in fact initiate that long causal chain of events that will lead down to Y. So many versions of this fallacy occur when it's argued that we shouldn't take some initial, presumably innocuous or innocent step because doing so will lead all the way down to disaster. Since it will lead to disaster, we can't take that initial step. So here's my example of a slippery slope fallacy argument. Immediate steps should be taken to outlaw birth control. If people have continued access to birth control, it will surely lead to an increase in promiscuity, which in turn will cause an increase in divorces, right? Because people don't like it when you're unfaithful to them. The increase in divorces will ultimately erode the moral fabric of our culture and cause the collapse of society, right? So birth control, collapse of society, where there's a long causal chain of events where taking that initial step, having access to birth control, where there's not enough evidence to suggest that that will lead to increases in promiscuity, and then increases in divorce, and then the erosion of our moral fabric, and then the collapse of society. So, you know, it's like the argument that says, if you if you try one drug, then the next thing you know, you're going to be selling yourself for heroin money or something like that, right? So there's a commercial with a humorous version of this as well. It's a DirecTV commercial. So you can look the commercial up on YouTube if you want. I have the dialogue of it here, and it runs as follows. When your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you blow off steam. When you blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, they want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up on a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. So here I have a reconstructed version of that. Is a big hypothetical, what's called a hypothetical syllogism argument that consists of a long chain of if-then statements. But again, it's a slippery slope example, meaning that the content of this argument is such that there's a weak connection between the if-then, all of the if-thens, such that if we keep cable, or we don't get DirecTV, that it's going to lead down the road to me getting beaten up and tossed into a roadside ditch. So that's an example of what's called a fallacy of weak induction. There's another scene from The Daily Show you can look up where Stewart accuses his guest, in this case Bill Bennett, of making a slippery slope argument. He uses that language explicitly. All right, next we have false dichotomy. Also, other names for this one include false dilemma, false bifurcation. Many times it's just called the either-or fallacy. Right? And it's committed when an arguer or an argument presents two alternatives as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, when in fact there's at least a third option that, or another option rather, I should say, that is left out. So sometimes we get, I just did it there, I got tripped up on the idea that it's two options. Well, it could be three options, but if a fourth that are presented as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, but if it really just obscured or left out a fourth possibility, we'd still have a false dichotomy there. So again, it's when the options that are presented as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, when in fact they don't. They leave out some possible logical alternative. So I got a couple of options here, or examples here. Either morality is based on religion or anything goes. So in Rick and Morty, sometimes it's presented as if, if God doesn't exist, then everything is meaningless, and there is no really any morality. You should just do what you want. So either morality is based on religion or anything goes. You reject religion, so there's the denial of one of those options. Thus, you must believe that anything goes. Here's another example of a false dichotomy argument. You either agree with the president's policies on terrorism, or you support terrorism. You disagree with the president's policies, thus you support terrorists. So in each of these versions, it looks like a valid disjunctive syllogism argument, but because of the language that's used, it's obscuring or excluding an alternative. So in this case, we would say that the dichotomy is false. It's got a false premise in there because of an informal, because of an informal fallacy based on the content that's offered. So in both of these versions here, the either-or premise in both of these arguments leaves out a third logical possibility. In the first example, it's the possibility of being non-religious and committed to some moral viewpoint. We'll study many of those later in the semester. And in the second options, it's that it's logically possible for you to both disagree with the president's policies on terrorism and not be a terrorist supporter, right? And to disagree with terrorism. So those are the options that's left out. So sometimes people get tripped up when they're learning this. They think, oh, well, it's got an either or. That means it's a false dichotomy. Well, just because it's got an either or premise doesn't mean it's a false either or premise. You always got to, in order to show it's false, you got to identify the logical possible option. And then if you can do that, then it's a false premise. But some dichotomies really are true either ors, either logically speaking or pragmatically speaking in terms of practical reasoning. All right, so detecting these fallacies, you got to have a solid grasp of the fallacies themselves, the informal fallacies and their basic ideas. You need to be attentive to what the reasoning is, right? And think about how to boil the argument down to its basic inference or inferences. That means having a clear grasp of what the speaker is trying to convey. If it's not clear, you might have to run through the different interpretations that are possible and see if those are fallacious, if any. And then you need to be able to distinguish between inferential passages, arguments, and non-arguments, non-inferential passages. So it's important to point out that in order to have a fallacy present, it has to be an argument. Right? In order to have an argument, you got to have at least one premise and a conclusion and an alleged connection between them. If you don't have an argument, you can't have a fallacy. So fallacies are committed for a variety of reasons. We might be careless, right? We might not know the right information. Sometimes they are committed by accident, but if they're committed by accident or intentionally, they're still fallacious. Some person might be using fallacies intentionally to try to manipulate someone, right? Or we might just have a careless or lazy or a tired mental attitude, right? Try to avoid all of those problems when we're trying to sort out the truth of these philosophical positions, right? So here's an example of a question, right? And I'm going to use this to drive home that point that a fallacy is an error in reasoning or an error in argumentation. So you got to have an argument there. And again, we got a technical definition of an argument to worry about. So what informal fallacy, if any, is committed in the following passage? And the passage is John Smith is a jerk. Usually I do this in class and I'll ask the class, how many people think that this is a fallacious argument? Nearly every time I've done this, and I've done this for years, lots and lots of hands, a majority of hands go up and they say, that's an ad hominem. Called him a jerk. But it's not an ad hominem, right? It is only one sentence. And in order to have an argument, you got to have at least two statements. You got to have a premise and a conclusion, right? So not just two statements, but two statements such that one, the truth of one of them, the premise, is said to support the truth of the other, the conclusion. So in other words, you got to have premises and conclusions there, right? That's just one statement. So contrast John Smith is a jerk with John Smith is a jerk, therefore his view about taxation is false. There I've committed an ad hominem fallacy because I'm giving the fact that I think he is a jerk as the reason for rejecting the truth of a conclusion that he's offered. All right, so that's ad hominem abusive. One sentence by itself does not make an argument. In order to have a fallacy, you got to have an argument there. So again, that definition of an argument, that definition of a fallacy is very important. All right, so that wraps up the material for this little brief part of the logic lesson. If you want some practice identifying fallacies, you could maybe watch a movie called Thank You for Smoking, which is excellent practice for that. There are many fallacies in there, many of which we didn't cover, but it contains a lot of them, including ones that we did cover. You can also look at the worksheet that's posted on Moodle that's a fallacy practice there. So that'll give you some extra practice identifying these if you need some of that. There are hundreds and hundreds of informal fallacies. If you go to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look at the fallacy section, they've got a whole long list, and that's probably not even all of them. So we'll just work with these basic ones for now, and we're going to add to this a little bit later in the semester, especially when we get to the philosophy of religion section. There's a whole article devoted to another fallacy called false cause there. But this will wrap it up for this portion of the lesson. If you have questions about anything out of the assigned reading on basic logic, either the forms or types of arguments or the informal fallacies, feel free to ask those in the discussion forum or to ask them when we have a live Q&A session. So with that, we'll pause here, and you might want to review the material that we've covered so far. Second half of the lesson for logic here is on the law of non-contradiction. So that's the one you should look at next. All right, until then, I'll see y'all later.